Hi, I'm Zen and welcome to this video on understanding the before and after CSS pseudo elements. We have used this a few times in my videos already, but now is the time to really get into the wizardry of the CSS technique and understand its properties, including some of its most common uses, such as the ability to create semi-transparent backgrounds, which you can also animate like this, creating non-standard borders or underlines, as you can see here, creating rounded image borders, as we can see here, and finally bespoke counters and formatting, as we can see with these here. So let's run the intro reel and learn how to do it. As always, I do a little bit of standard housekeeping in my videos, so feel free to skip to the time you see on the video right now or look at the timestamps in the descriptions if you want to jump this, but this is actually quite a quick one. So as always, in the description there is a link to the files I'm using in this video. Of course you don't need them, just there if you want to follow along. Also, if you want to follow along exactly like me and therefore you want the same setup as me, I'm using Visual Studio Code and the Chrome browser, and if you follow the link that you can see in the corner, that card will take you to the Getting Started series where you can get the exact same setup as me. And that's the end of the housekeeping, so let's go into it. First thing we need to understand is what exactly are these things. The before and afters are CSS pseudo elements. They are elements which are created within the HTML by the CSS, which, I'll be honest, I think is a pretty cool thing. For those of you that know some JavaScript, it is more or less the equivalent of the insert adjacent HTML or insert adjacent text with the after begin and before end settings. No idea what I'm on about? Not to worry. Keep watching because all is going to be explained. This here is the simplest example of the before and after elements I could make. Here in the HTML, we have a simple paragraph with an ID of greeting and a text that says you must be, and we can see that right here on the right hand side with the live server. Now if I go into the demo CSS, we can see that I've commented these out, so I'm going to uncomment them, and as you can see we're using the greeting, which is the ID from the paragraph, and we're using these 2 colons and then the word before and 2 colons and the word after. And this is the CSS, how you do it. Whatever the element is, again, it follows all the standard rules. It can be a class, it can be an ID, it can be an element type, it can be a combination, you know, however you do your selector. And it's just 2 colons and before and 2 colons and after. And the most important part that you must have in the selectors for them to work, because the pseudo elements must have content. They can be empty, but they must have content. And this is literally the minimum I could do. Now, if you look on the right hand side, when I save this, we will see, there we go, that the hi and John has now been added to it. Still no change over here. This is still you must be, but this is what's happened. Now, if we jump into the developers tools, we can actually see what's happened. So here we are with the developers tools open. Let's just press an F12. And you can see I've opened up the paragraph tag and we can see the double colon before and the double colon after here. Notice the actual text is not being shown, just the actual elements that have been added. And you can actually see that if I click on before here, you can actually see the CSS rule that's being used and we can see the content that is there. It's also worth noting that the before is actually still inside the paragraph and the after is also inside the paragraph, but the before is before the paragraph's standard content and the after is after the paragraph's standard content, but are still within the actual element itself. So you can think of them as almost being children of the element. This is actually very different from how the JavaScript equivalent code works. So let's go and see what the JavaScript does. First thing we're going to do is to re-comment the CSS. So we can see that we're back to normal. And now if we open up the base CSS, we'll just uncomment that code. So we can see that we're using a event listener and we're setting the greeting ID. And again, you see we're doing the insert adjacent text, after begin and before end, and with the same ones, hi and John. And when we save that, we can see it comes up. However, unlike the CSS, you can see that the hi and the John are shown here, and the JavaScript code at run does not. So there's no after begin or before end there. And like I said, there are other variants to this. So now we have it as before begin and after end. And if we save that, we can see it's separated out because the hi is outside of the paragraph, and so is the John outside of the paragraph. So you can see why they turn up on different lines. So while this example is very good to illustrate how the before and after pseudo elements actually work, it's not a very practical use for it. Let's be honest, you could have just added the text in the HTML, but those of you that are astute will also note that basically with that in mind, anything that we do with the before and after pseudo elements, we could do just by adding it in the HTML in the first place. So why even bother with it anyway? And that, my friend, is a very good question. And the answer is why this video thumbnail has a red banner around it, as I believe the reason why we actually use the before and after pseudo element is an advanced subject. You see, the real answer to this is that it's about decluttering the HTML with unneeded HTML elements. Put simply, we want to minimize the amount of HTML code we use, and that the HTML code that we actually use in our website should be meaningful. This is something that is often referred to as the semantic web. There is, or at the time of this posting soon will be, a video in the Getting Started series called Understanding the Relationship Between HTML, CSS and Other Web Languages. In that video, one of the things I said about HTML is that it's essentially a content holder. That is its job. It's the job of the CSS to make it look nice. One of the problems of having a fancy website is that in order to make it look nice, we often have to add a lot of, well, let's basically call it what it is, junk HTML. And the reason why we have to add these junk HTML to the pages is that they've got nothing to do with the content itself, but it's in there so that we can use CSS to manipulate it to make the page look nice. We saw this, for example, as one of the solutions in the forms page of Into the Wild series, when we wanted to add a vertical separator between the registration and the login forms. And there are two main issues with this. The first issue is with search engines and the organic rankings of websites in their search result. Now, essentially, no one outside a search engine company themselves fully know the search engine ranking algorithm. Anyone who tells you they do are porcupines. No ifs, no ands, no buts about it. We do know, however, that it looks at the page's HTML, and let's be honest, it kind of has to. Now, when the search engine spiders look at the HTML, it looks for the elements tags used and the content and the relationship between the HTML and the content to work out how relevant that content is. When we have a lot of junk HTML elements whose sole purpose is display enhancement, it can be difficult for the search engines to understand your page properly and may not rank your page or the site high enough. And we all know the best place to hide a dead body is in the second page of Google search results. The second issue is that it makes it hard for us designers and coders to read a web page and make heads or tails of it. It can make the site maintenance and the upgrading of a site a nightmare. Trying to understand what element does what, and if we remove something, what will happen to the site, cannot be a fun thing to do. Whereas, when we just use the before and after pseudo elements, the HTML is much cleaner and consequently less cluttered. And since the before and after elements are glued onto the element itself, more or less, when we remove that element from the HTML, the before and after elements go with it. So now we've got that out of the way, time to see how we can use it. The first one is with modified borders. Borders have progressed a bit over the last few years, so that we can now have gradient style backgrounds. And as we can see, this is a simple example. In the HTML, it's very simple. You see we've just got an H1 tag with some text in it. And then in its CSS, it's a fairly simple rule. You see we're just using normal width, text align, margin. The trick here is that we set a border which is first of all solid and transparent, and then we use a border image in order for it to work. And this value here is very important, otherwise it will not work. We're not going to be explaining how border images work normally. That will be yet again another video. And so if I've done that video and you want to watch it, it might be appearing about nowish. Now, a lot of the time we don't actually want it all the way around. We actually want to use it as a underliner. And obviously that is very simple to fix. We just change this to border bottom. And there we have it. Now, with the fact that we're using an image for, or a gradient in this case, for the border, it does give us a nice underline. However, we are limited in what we can do with it, simply because the entire size of this border is fixed. It's fixed to the size of the element. So unless we're going to change the padding or the width of the element itself, this is going to be the same size. And also we can't add any little touches to it or move it to the left or move it to the right if we don't want it in the center. And this is where using pseudo elements really come in. And this is the code that we need. Again, you can see an empty content this time. We set the width to 80%, so it's not all the way. Of course, you can choose any value you want. We set a height of 5 pixels, so it's actually slightly smaller than what we've got there. If we want to match it, we can obviously match that there. Okay. And then we're using position absolute. And because the title itself was relative, that means that this position is based on the top left-hand corner of the element. And so we use position absolute so we can move it around. So we've got it 5 pixels below the bottom of the element would be naturally. And we moved it left by 10% since we've got the width at 80, which puts us directly in the middle. Of course, you can play around with these values to get it into a style that you prefer. And that's not all we can do. We can use some simple skewing to add a nice effect to this as well. So here is the simple skew. Okay, we're skewing it on the x-axis at -45 degrees to make it look quite nice there. And of course, since we're using the after, we can double this up with the before if we want one on the top as well. And here we have it. There are some obviously minor changes with the before. For example, we've set the top to being 0, just so it is roughly the same distance as the bottom is away from the text. And we've reversed the skewing so that we have something that matches up nicely. And there you have a really nice, simple, modified border. This leads us nicely into the next bit where we are looking at image borders with rounded edges. At the time of making this video, it is not possible using standard CSS and HTML to create image borders with rounded edges. You can create image borders, you saw that right at the start, but not with rounded edges. The border radius code is just invalid. However, using the before and after pseudo elements, we can fake it. So let's have a look at that. So here we are with borders2.html, and you can see we've just got a very simple paragraph with 3 lines of text in it. The CSS for this is also equally simple. We've got a background color for the body, and then we've got the positioning data for the paragraph, as well as some bits to make it look, well, I would say nice, but it's not really that nice, is it? But, you know, just some formatting for it. To get an image border, the cheat is fairly simple. We're going to be using our pseudo element to hold the image. This will then be put below the paragraph using the Z index. We will then do some border settings, which will allow the background image to be visible as the border. So first we need to add the border details to the paragraph. And here's that code. 2 things really here to note: that the border has been set to transparent. Most people probably don't realize that's even an option for a border. The second is this background clip. This is the true key here. It stops the background color from bleeding into the border area. So now we've got to add our pseudo element. And here it is. Again, nice and simple. We've got empty content. We're using position absolute because we're using position relative here. It means we can position it based on the parent element. Notice we're using -4 top left, bottom and right, which happens to be the thickness of the border. So this will make it the same size as the content plus the 4 pixels, which will allow the background to bleed through to where the border would normally be. And again, rather than using an actual image, we're just using a linear gradient going from red to blue at a 45-degree angle. And then to make sure that it goes behind it, we're using a Z index of -1. We're also using a border radius of 40 pixels, just like it is in the paragraph rule itself. So we save this, and look at that. We have a image border there. Something that can't be done using normal HTML and CSS. Using the pseudo element as a background border is a really nice segue into the next trick, which is using transparent backgrounds. So let me preface this first with the fact that all images that we use in a website should be fully prepared and optimized before we start to use them. So if you wanted to use a semi-transparent image, you should already made it into a semi-transparent PNG or WebP image before you use it. This being said, there may be some weird reason why you can't, or you want to use some kind of animation where we are going to be changing the transparency of the element. And luckily, that's what we can do with the before and after pseudo elements. As you may not already know, when you set the opacity of an element, it affects all parts of that element. It can't just be applied to a single part of it, such as the background. It will affect not just the background, but the text and all of the images within that element, and in fact, all of the children of that element as well. They will all inherit that level of opacity or transparency. To illustrate this, we have background.html here. Essentially, as you can see, it has two classes, one called area and one called area2. And that is essentially the only difference between them. The internals are the same. They both have a paragraph with a lot of text and with an image in there as well. The CSS is equally fairly straightforward. Here you can see both area and area 2 has the identical CSS, with the only difference being the first one, area, having the background image being attached to the pseudo after class, and with the area 2, that the background image is applied directly to the element. Then we just have some paragraph and images values. So let's see what this looks like. As we can see, both elements look identical. There's no difference in them whatsoever. Now we add the opacity values, and here we can see the difference. Again, just to clarify, in the area we see that the opacity has been applied to the after, whereas in area 2 it's been applied directly to the element. So here in the browser we can see that the top one is in fact area, and we can see the background image has faded out, making the text a lot easier to read, whereas on the second one, area 2, we can see that everything has faded down, which makes both of them quite hard to read. What is nice about this system is that, as I said before, this can be animated. So to do that, the first thing we need to do is to add this transition rule. So we're setting the transition of opacity to 0.5. Notice I've done it in both the area and area 2, and also in the area after. You'll see why in a moment. The second thing that I did is down here, I've added the hover rule for the change. So both for area hover after and area 2 hover. And this bit is quite important. Notice the order that this is done. First of all, we do area hover, then we add the after, but there is no space between the hover and the double colons. Okay, a lot of people might try to do this the other way, do area double colon after colon hover. That will not work. People might also try and do it with a space here because you think after is a descendant selector of hover, and I don't think that works either. It's best to keep them together. So with that done and we save it, we can see that now when we roll over this one, the background comes in, and with this one the whole thing comes in. So we can see in effect that where this might be useful if you want the whole thing faded out and then fade in when you put your mouse over it, whereas this one allows the background. But like I said, with a little bit of ingenuity, we can actually get this so that the foreground image and text fades out whilst the background image fades in. So how would we do this? Now I know what you're thinking. We could animate the area div element, so this one here, and have that fade out. But that won't work since the after pseudo element is inside of the div, which means even if we set the after to the value of 1 or even 2 to try and double it, it will still be semi-transparent or invisible as it is part of the main element. So your next thought might be to use the before pseudo class and to add all of this paragraph information as the content to our pseudo element. Unfortunately, that won't work either. And the only reason why that won't work is that there are very strict rules in what can go into the content. Now the content area can hold text, it can hold image references, and a few other things which we're going to be looking at in a follow-up video. But what you can't do is just put in any HTML. If you try and copy and paste that paragraph text into there, it just will not work. Ironically though, the solution to this is actually really easy. So here we are in the paragraph rule where we've added the transition for 1 second. Just found this timing works a bit better. And then down here, again, we've got the area hover, and this time we set the paragraph to an opacity of 0. And remember, the image is inside of the paragraph, so that will inherit the opacity or transparency value of the paragraph. If we had multiple elements in this, we might have created a parent div so that we could control that, which would then control its children. But this works fine for us. So again, we save this, and now we'll see that as we do this, look at that. A really nice, simple animation using the after pseudo element. Now, if I'm being honest, I probably would have done this in reverse in a real website. So perhaps as a bit of a gallery, then as people move their mouse over the image, it would actually have the image fade out with the data or the information about that image coming to the forefront, so we could read the information about the image, maybe the cost of it, where it came from, etc., etc. The final example that we're going to be covering today is bespoke counters. What do I mean by this? Well, let's have a look at counters HTML so that it makes a bit more sense. Although counters can be used with any element, it is mostly done in ordered lists, and that is what counters HTML uses. So this is the HTML that we've got. As you can see, we've got an unordered list with 3 list items which themselves hold paragraphs. The CSS for this is fairly straightforward. Again, a background to the body. We have the ordered list being positioned, the list items positioning themselves, and then a little bit of margin with the paragraphs. This in turn will create this layout, which there's nothing wrong with it, but you know, it can be a little bit boring. Now these numbers on the side is because we're using an ordered list, because it's dictating the order in which the list should be followed. If it wasn't that, it would be an unordered list. There are some customizations that we can do with the list style types, but it is very restricted, and this is where our before and after pseudo classes again come and save us. Now this video is probably going to be long enough as it is already, so that I can't go into how counters work properly. If you are interested in how to use counters, again, there is a video coming, so there might be a card shown up in the window to direct you to that video if it is already done. If it's not there, then thank you for being an early watcher. Make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification button so that when my video does drop on it, you know when to come back and watch it. First thing we're going to do is to reset the counter and give the counter a name. So here we've called it my counter and we've reset it in the ordered list element. Next, we've added the counter increment. So each time it goes into the li element, it will increase the counter value. And secondly, we have disabled the standard list style item types. So these will disappear. So if we save this and see what happens, there you go, the numbers disappear. Nothing else happens just yet. Now we add the after pseudo element. Of course, it could be before. I just have a preference using after. So here is the important bit, or one of the important bits. We are adding the counter as the content to the after pseudo element. And we are setting in particular the uppercase Roman numerals number system, and we set it to the color green because I wanted to, and we've just got a little bit of positioning information. So we can save that and see what it looks like, and we can see it's quite nicely positioned already due to this piece of code that we put in. The next bit we do is to add some width and height values as well as some padding and the borders, just basically so we get them all of the same sizes regardless of how big the actual numbers are. Again, we save that, and well, let's see. Once we finish crime, because the numbers aren't where we want to be, they're not centered, they look a bit nasty, but we say to ourselves, not a problem, we can fix that because we're clever. And so we use the flex display in order to center the numbers correctly. So again, we save that, and look at that, perfectly in the middle. Obviously, I've used some rather large numbers here. We could make it a bit smaller. And here we are with a slightly updated values, just to make these look a bit smaller and slightly more elegant. As I said before, this doesn't have to be done just on lists. So what I did is I've created counters2.html, which is essentially exactly the same, but without the list. So you can see we're just using a normal div and paragraphs. And as you can see, we've got exactly the same result. And again, we can look at the CSS and you can see it is basically the same. We're just obviously applying it to slightly different elements. Looking at the length of this video already, it's quite long. There are some more uses of the before and after pseudo elements that I want to cover. So that will be coming in a later video. So again, please do like and subscribe and hit that notification button so you don't miss the videos as they come out. I do try my best to have one being released every weekend, generally on a Saturday, but time isn't always on my side since I don't make any money on these videos, at least not yet. Which also means if there is a use that you've heard of that people use the before and after pseudo elements and you'd like me to cover it, please do put it in the comments and I will try my best to incorporate it in the next video. That's how I do on this. So all that's left for me to say is to thank you for staying with me all the way. If you have found something in this video useful, like I've said a couple of times already, please do consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. Every single subscription means the world to me, honestly, it really does. Also, if there's a video you want me to do or if you want to ask me anything, please just whack it in the comments section. I honestly do read every single comment that comes up. I shall see you guys next time. This is Sen, signing out.